The night was supposed to be like any other. A group of officers patrolling the streets, looking for an easy target, someone they could harass without consequences. When they spotted a black man stepping out of his brand new Jeep, they didn't see a person. They saw an opportunity. Without hesitation, they swarmed the vehicle, smashing windows, laughing as if it were a game. What they didn't know was that their so-called target wasn't just any man. He was the inspector sent to evaluate their department, the very person who held their future in his hands. And in that moment, as the glass shattered around him, he stayed quiet, watching them dig their own graves. The real question now wasn't whether these officers would get away with it. It was how long it would take for them to realize they had just destroyed their own careers. The inspector stood still, his heart pounding, but his face remained calm. He had seen corruption before, but this was something else. The officers were laughing, bragging about how no one would believe a word he said. One of them even smirked and said, "What's a guy like you doing in a car like this anyway?" He didn't answer. Instead, he observed. The arrogance, the recklessness, it all painted a clear picture of men who thought they were untouchable. He had read complaints about this unit before, but now he was seeing it firsthand. The abuse of power, the complete lack of fear. One officer reached for his ID, ready to dismiss him as just another nobody. But the moment they saw his credentials, the laughter faded. Eyes widened, hands stiffened. Suddenly, they weren't so sure of themselves. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The silence that followed was louder than the shattering glass. The officers, who had been so sure of themselves just moments ago, were now frozen in place, their eyes darting between each other. The inspector didn't move. He let the weight of the moment sink in. One officer, the one who had been the most aggressive, cleared his throat and forced a laugh. "Hey, man, this is all just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice suddenly much softer. The others quickly nodded, their cocky grins replaced with nervous frowns. But the inspector wasn't here for their excuses. He had come to this department for a reason: too many complaints, too many reports swept under the rug. And now, standing in the wreckage of his own car, he had all the proof he needed. The real test wasn't whether these officers would try to backpedal. It was how deep their corruption really went, and just how many more people had suffered because of it. The officers scrambled, trying to regain control of the situation. One of them stepped forward, forcing a grin. "Look, sir, we had no idea who you were. If we did, this wouldn't have happened." His words only made things worse. So it was never about right or wrong, only about power. The inspector folded his arms, watching them fumble through weak excuses. Another officer muttered something under his breath, glaring at his partner for speaking too much. They were panicking now, realizing that every word, every movement was digging them in deeper. Then the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the air. More officers were arriving, drawn by the commotion. But whose side were they on? Would they try to protect their own, or had the inspector just exposed something much bigger than a few bad cops? For the first time that night, the inspector wasn't the only one feeling trapped. As more officers arrived, the tension thickened. The inspector could see it in their faces. Some looked confused, others suspicious. A few glanced at the shattered Jeep, then at their colleagues, as if trying to piece together what had happened. But there was something else, a shift in the air. Then, one of the new arrivals stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid. The badge on his chest read, "Lieutenant Carter." His eyes locked onto the inspector, then flickered toward the officers who had attacked him. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke. "What's going on here?" Before the inspector could answer, one of the guilty officers jumped in. "We thought he was stealing the vehicle, sir. We were just doing our job." His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, twitching at his sides. Carter's gaze hardened. He knew something wasn't right. But was he here to uncover the truth or cover it up? The inspector held Carter's gaze, waiting to see which side he was on. The guilty officers stood rigid, their earlier arrogance now replaced with unease. Then, without breaking eye contact, Carter pulled out his radio. "All units, report to my location immediately," he said, his voice calm but firm. Panic rippled through the group. "Sir, there's no need for that," one officer blurted out, his voice cracking. "We handled the situation." Carter ignored him. His eyes were still locked onto the inspector, studying him, piecing together what had really happened. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he turned to his men. "Hands on your heads," he ordered. Silence. No one moved. Then one officer, the same one who had led the attack, took a step back. "Carter, come on," he whispered. But Carter wasn't listening. As backup arrived, the inspector exhaled. Justice had come, but not in the way they had expected. As the guilty officers were cuffed and led away, the inspector finally let the weight of the night settle in. They had walked into their own downfall, too blinded by arrogance to see it coming. Some pleaded, some stayed silent, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Carter turned to the inspector. "I had my doubts about this department," he admitted, "but I didn't expect it to be this bad." The inspector nodded. "Now you see why I was sent here." With the truth exposed, there was no more room for cover-ups. The department would have to face the consequences, and those who thought they were untouchable had just learned otherwise. As the inspector looked at his wrecked Jeep one last time, he knew this was bigger than just one night. Change was coming, and for the first time in a long time, justice had finally won.